Over 670 lives would be extinguished by day's end across 3 brutal engagements: a morning ambush, a desperate camp defense, and a final, horrific confrontation at a place later dubbed Bloody Pond. It all began with a seemingly straightforward reinforcement mission. But on the 8th of September, 1755, near Lake George, calculations went horribly wrong. The forest concealed a meticulously planned trap, and the first shots ignited a firestorm of violence that would consume friend and foe alike in an unimaginable bloodbath. On the 8th of September, 1755, inland from the shores of Lake George, New York, a column of 1,200 provincial troops, accompanied by their Mohawk allies, marched toward Fort Lyman. Their objective was reinforcement. Unseen by them, a combined force of French-Canadian regulars, militia, and allied native warriors had established a hook-shaped ambush along the Wood Creek Road, anticipating the column's path. The stillness of the morning was broken prematurely. A native warrior allied with the French discharged his musket before the entirety of the British and provincial column had entered the kill zone. This single, early shot alerted the marching men, preventing their complete envelopment. Despite this, the head of the column, comprised of 170 Mohawk warriors, walked directly into concentrated fire. They suffered the most severe casualties in the initial volley. Among the fallen were dozens of Mohawk warriors and their respected leader, Chief Hendrick. Colonel Ephraim Williams of Massachusetts, another key leader at the front, was also killed early in the engagement. Chaos erupted. With the senior command at the head of the column neutralized, Colonel Nathan Whiting of Connecticut, positioned further back, took decisive command. Whiting, observing the unfolding disaster, ordered his men at the rear of the formation to take cover along the Wood Creek Road. This rearguard action provided crucial time and covering fire, allowing the beleaguered Massachusetts men and the surviving Mohawk warriors to begin a fighting retreat. The French and their allies, perhaps sensing a quick victory, pressed their advantage with an aggressive pursuit. However, their eagerness exposed them to the Provincials' retreating fire. As the Provincials fell back, they inflicted significant casualties on their pursuers, a cost proportional to what they had themselves endured. The retreat was a desperate affair. While the provincial soldiers and Mohawk warriors hastily made their way back towards Major General William Johnson's main camp, Johnson himself began urgent preparations to receive both the survivors and the anticipated follow-up attack from Baron de Dieskau's forces. Over the next 90 minutes, remnants of the ambushed column staggered into Johnson's encampment. Colonel Whiting's command, having maintained a degree of order during the withdrawal, eventually broke from their fighting retreat and sprinted the final 3/4 of a mile, reaching the relative safety of the camp around noon. The morning's engagement had been a brutal introduction to the day's hostilities. Major General William Johnson's camp was situated approximately 300 yards from the lake. Its defensive potential was dictated by the terrain. A hill rose to its left, while a broad, swampy depression protected its right. The open front, through which an attack was most likely, spanned no more than 200 yards. Upon the return of the survivors from the Bloody Morning Scout, and with the imminent threat of Dieskau's main force, the camp became a scene of frantic activity. A defensive line was hastily organized. A roll call of the regiments established their positions from left to right. Fitch's Connecticut companies, the 1st New York Regiment, the 1st and 2nd Connecticut Regiments, and then the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Massachusetts Regiments anchoring the right. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, having arrived back at camp somewhat disorganized after the morning's ambush, was broken into smaller detachments. These men were rearmed and strategically placed by their officers where they were deemed most needed, typically reinforcing the flanks or held as a mobile reserve. General Johnson directed the immediate fortification of the camp. Artillery pieces, including 18-pounder and 32-pounder cannons, were manhandled from their temporary emplacements within the camp and repositioned to command the road, the expected avenue of the French assault. Captain William Eyre was given command of the artillery. Uprooted trees were dragged into position to form makeshift breastworks, and supply wagons were overturned to provide additional cover for the infantry. Sharpshooters dispersed, seeking out optimal firing positions from which they could deliver deadly aimed shots. These improvised defenses, though far from perfect, created an open killing ground of approximately 100 yards directly in front of the camp, facing the road. Within the camp, the scene was one of controlled chaos. A medical tent was designated to receive the wounded from the morning's ambush, and surgeons worked amidst the turmoil of men preparing for another, larger battle. The air was thick with tension as soldiers reloaded muskets, checked flints, and awaited the inevitable French advance. The psychological impact of the morning's defeat weighed heavily, yet the urgency of the situation spurred them to action. Having pursued the retreating provincial forces for over 3 miles along the road, Baron de Dieskau ordered his force to halt just half a mile from Johnson's camp. The French commander assessed that a swift, decisive assault was necessary to break Johnson's line and secure victory. He detailed 220 regular soldiers from the esteemed de la Sarre and Languedoc regiments for a bayonet charge. The grenadiers, the elite shock troops of the French army, were specifically tasked to penetrate the teeth of the provincial defenses, creating a breach for a conclusive follow-up attack. From behind their hastily erected barricades of felled trees and overturned wagons, the provincial forces watched the French regulars deploy. The provincials were, for the most part, modestly trained and equipped, their strength lying more in the fluid tactics of wilderness fighting than in the rigid linear formations of European battlefields. Nevertheless, the sight of disciplined French professionals advancing with bayonets fixed was imposing. Phineas Lyman, a Connecticut officer, later wrote of this moment, "Their arms glittered like the sun with bayonets fixed and confident, I presume, to march directly into our camp and sweep all before them as any army ever had." The provincial soldiers, many experiencing formal European-style warfare for the first time, gripped their muskets and waited. General Johnson, sensing the apprehension among his men, mounted his horse and rode along the defensive line, offering words of encouragement to bolster their resolve. The French grenadiers advanced with disciplined precision, marching steadily towards the provincial line, halting just beyond the effective range of the defenders' muskets. On command, the French line delivered a crashing volley. However, aimed high or absorbed by the makeshift barricades, this initial fusillade caused surprisingly little damage to the entrenched provincials. The Colonial response was markedly different. Soldiers from New England and New York leveled their firearms over their log breastworks and returned fire. This was immediately augmented by Captain Eyre's artillery. Solid shot from the 18 and 32-pounder cannons tore through the French ranks. One observer recorded that the effect of the grapeshot and cannonballs was devastating, cutting lanes, streets, and alleys through their enemy. The psychological impact was instantaneous. The initial confidence of the French grenadiers wavered, then broke. Their orderly lines disintegrated as soldiers scrambled for cover in the woods flanking the camp, seeking refuge from the punishing artillery and musket fire. More disastrous for Dieskau than the casualties inflicted by the artillery was the reaction of his native allies. Positioned on the flanks, they witnessed the initial bloody repulse of the regulars. Unwilling to advance into the open killing ground under the muzzles of the provincial cannons, and disinclined to engage in a frontal assault against their Mohawk kinsmen fighting alongside the British, they remained in the relative safety of the forest. They disregarded all of Dieskau's orders to advance and support the regulars. The death of their highly respected war chief, Jacques Lagardeur de Saint-Pierre, during the morning's ambush, had significantly weakened Dieskau's ability to command their obedience. The Canadian militia, witnessing the reluctance of their Abenaki and Nipissing allies and the brutal effect of the defensive fire, also refused calls to advance into the exposed area before the provincial entrenchments. Baron de Dieskau, his authority eroding and his tactical options narrowing, realized that if the provincial line was to be broken, it would have to be by the bayonets of his remaining European regulars alone. During the initial exchange of fire, General William Johnson was struck in the buttock by a French musket ball. Though the wound was exceedingly painful, it was not immediately judged to be life-threatening. Nevertheless, it forced him to retire to the designated medical tent for treatment, effectively transferring field command of the ongoing battle to General Phineas Lyman of Connecticut. Under Lyman's command, the provincial troops, many of whom were anxious and comparatively inexperienced in sustained firefights, began to discharge their muskets with frenetic speed. This rapid, often unaimed fire threatened to deplete their ammunition reserves prematurely. Lyman moved quickly along the line, his voice hoarse as he yelled at the men to save ammunition. He warned them that if they expended their powder and shot recklessly, they would become sitting ducks for the French to surround. Lyman's forceful intervention had an effect. The rate of fire became more controlled. He would later write of their performance under this immense pressure. Never men or rowmen fought better in the world. However, not all accounts painted such a uniformly heroic picture of the provincial soldiery. Peter Wraxall, Johnson's aide-de-camp, offered a different perspective on the conduct of some men that day. He noted that many of our people hid themselves, and many pretended to be sick. Wraxall detailed his own frustrated attempts to rouse these reluctant individuals and compel them back to their positions on the line, efforts which he admitted met with very little success. Meanwhile, the French regulars, despite their initial repulse and the defection of their allies, continued their attempts to breach the center of the provincial line. The Connecticut regiment, positioned closest to the road where the main French thrusts were directed, bore the brunt of these assaults and suffered the heaviest casualties among the defenders. For over 2 hours that afternoon, Captain Eyre's artillery maintained a relentless fire, methodically pounding the French formations each time they attempted to reform and advance. A provincial soldier described this phase of the battle as a bloody cycle, repeated over and over, with very little damage to the colonial camp and ever-increasing losses among the French regulars. Baron de Dieskau, witnessing the futility of repeated frontal assaults against the well-defended center in the face of superior artillery, was eventually forced to acknowledge the grim reality of his situation. He would later write that his regulars attacking the center received the whole of the enemy's fire and nearly perished there to the last man. Recognizing the need for a change in tactics, he ordered the focus of his attack to shift towards the right flank of the Colonial line. This sector was defended by the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Massachusetts regiments. These Massachusetts men had, up to this point, been primarily engaged in skirmishing with Canadian and native warriors firing from the cover of the woods. Now, under the command of Colonel Moses Titcomb, they were tasked with repelling the regrouped French grenadiers who were maneuvering to assault their position. As the French regulars began their advance against the Massachusetts regiments, Captain Eyre skillfully redirected his cannons. A well-aimed blast of canister shot from a 32-pounder tore into the advancing grenadiers, momentarily stalling their attack and throwing their formations into disarray. The French grenadier assault on the provincial right faltered under the canister shot from Captain Eyre's artillery and the steady musket fire of the Massachusetts regiments. In an effort to rally his men and inspire renewed determination, Colonel Moses Titcomb of Massachusetts, along with his lieutenant, boldly advanced from their line towards a large, fallen tree that offered some forward cover. It was a conspicuous act of leadership, intended to demonstrate courage and steadfastness. However, their exposed position drew immediate and concentrated enemy fire. A volley of musket balls struck both men, and they fell, killed instantly. Their bodies lay starkly on the contested ground, mere meters from the provincial line they had sought to encourage. While the fighting raged at the camp's perimeter, Baron de Dieskau and his trusted second-in-command, Chevalier de Montreuil, attempted to organize a coordinated attack by bringing their Canadian and native allies into the main fight. These forces had largely remained in the woods, disengaged from the direct assaults on the fortified camp. To their profound disappointment, Dieskau and Montreuil discovered that most of their erstwhile allies had not just broken ranks, but had actually departed the immediate vicinity of the camp. They had instead returned to the site of the morning's ambush, the Bloody Morning Scout, to engage in the grim business of looting the fallen and scalping the provincial prisoners who had been captured and tied to trees earlier in the day. By now, it was after 3 p.m., and any realistic hope of the French forces overrunning Johnson's defenses was rapidly diminishing. The provincial line, though battered, held firm, and their artillery continued to exact a heavy toll. Determined to make one final, desperate effort to shift the momentum of the grueling battle in his favor, Baron de Dieskau resolved to personally lead another charge. He moved forward into an exposed area, attempting to rally his regulars for this last push. Almost immediately, he was struck by a musket ball that pierced his leg. As Chevalier de Montreuil knelt to tend to his commander's wound, possibly offering him a drink of brandy, Dieskau was hit again, this time a ball tearing through his hip. Mortally wounded, the French commander was dragged away from the thickest of the fighting by 2 Canadian soldiers. During this perilous retreat, one of the Canadians carrying him was shot and killed. Aware of his dire situation and the danger to his rescuer, Dieskau instructed the surviving Canadian to leave him and save himself. The sight of their commander falling and the continued flight of the remaining Canadian and native combatants from the field signaled the final collapse of the French attack. The French regulars were now alone, exhausted, and severely depleted in numbers. Chevalier de Montreuil, now in command of the remnants of Dieskau's force, gallantly attempted to rally the regulars for yet another stand or an organized retreat. However, the psychological impact of seeing their allies deserting them, coupled with their severe losses, rendered further organized resistance untenable. Behind the provincial earthworks, the Mohawk warriors, sensing the decisive shift in the battle's tide, began to raise their distinctive war cries. Recognizing that the long, bloody day was nearing its climax, they surged forward. Clambering over the log barricades and charging into the open field with tomahawks raised, their movements swift and relentless. Inspired by this sudden and ferocious counterattack, the provincial soldiers also rose from their defenses and joined the pursuit, firing upon the now retreating French regulars as they chased them from the battlefield and into the surrounding woods. The main engagement at the camp was over. The Provincials and their Mohawk allies returned to their fortified positions. The elation of their hard-won victory was necessarily tempered by the grim realities facing them. Only a few hours of daylight remained, and Johnson's camp was filled with wounded men requiring urgent medical attention. There were also French prisoners to be secured and interrogated, and crucially, the ever-present threat of a renewed attack by French reinforcements meant that vigilance could not be relaxed. Among the prisoners brought into Johnson's camp was Baron de Dieskau himself. As he was being assisted from the field, a New England provincial soldier, believing the wounded French commander was reaching for a weapon, fired his musket, inflicting a fourth, grievous wound that pierced Dieskau's bladder. Later, a group of Mohawk warriors, incensed by their own heavy losses, including that of Chief Hendrick, sought to execute the captured French general. General Johnson, however, intervened directly, persuading the Mohawks to relinquish their claim on Dieskau's life, thereby sparing him. The cessation of the main French assault provided a much-needed respite for Johnson's weary soldiers. Yet, the day's bloody work was not entirely concluded. Indeed, what some considered the most brutal episode was yet to unfold. The preceding night, General Johnson had dispatched a wagoner, Jacob Adams, to Fort Lyman with a warning of the impending French attack. Adams, unfortunately, rode directly into the French encampment in the dark and was shot and killed. The sound of this lone gunshot had been heard by scouts sent out from Fort Lyman. Following a council of war held at Fort Lyman on the morning of the 8th of September, a relief force was organized. Captain Nathaniel Folsom, with 143 men from his New Hampshire regiment, and Captain William McGinnis, leading 90 men from a New York regiment, were ordered to proceed from Fort Lyman. Their initial instructions were to gather intelligence while advancing along the military road. However, as they marched, the distinct sounds of cannon and musket fire grew increasingly louder from the direction of Lake George. Folsom and McGinnis conferred and made the critical decision to deviate from their orders. Correctly surmising that Johnson's force was heavily engaged, they turned their combined detachment towards the sounds of battle. Shortly after 5 p.m. that same day, Folsom's and McGinnis's men stumbled upon the encampment of several hundred Canadian and native combatants. These were largely the same forces that had disengaged from the main assault on Johnson's camp earlier and were now resting near a small, secluded pond. Without hesitation, Captain Folsom ordered his New Hampshire men to attack. They surged forward, delivering a punishing volley into the surprised enemy. After about 6 volleys had been exchanged, Captain McGinnis's New Yorkers arrived and joined the fray. The engagement was fierce and lasted for nearly an hour. As the momentum of the fight began to wane, a determined captain, likely McGinnis, led a small group of his men in a direct charge against the enemy position. The Canadian and native fighters, already exhausted and demoralized from the day's prolonged battle at Johnson's camp, broke and fled, abandoning their ground and supplies to the victorious Provincials. In the aftermath of this sharp engagement, the New York and New Hampshire irregulars surveyed the numerous enemy dead scattered around the small pond. They proceeded to dispose of the bodies by casting them into the water. The sheer number of corpses turned the pond's murky water a horrifying crimson. This small body of water and the brutal events that transpired there would henceforth be known as Bloody Pond. The cost of this subsidiary victory was also significant. Captain McGinnis was mortally wounded, having been shot through the head. After considerable debate among the surviving officers, Captain Folsom decided that his men would depart the area at dawn the following day. They remained on high alert throughout the night, anticipating a possible counterattack from the enemy they had just routed. As the first light of the 9th of September illuminated the landscape, Folsom's men began their march, passing through a scene of appalling carnage. The preceding day's multiple engagements had left an indelible mark on the forest and the road. Bodies lay strewn along their path and in the edges of the woods. Some were soldiers killed in the heat of battle. Others presented a more disturbing sight: men tied to trees, evidently executed, scalped, and in some instances subjected to further mutilations. The victory at Lake George, encompassing the bloody morning scout, the defense of Johnson's camp, and the subsequent action at Bloody Pond, was a significant achievement for the British colonial forces. They had successfully repulsed a major French offensive, thereby preventing an unimpeded French advance towards Albany and, potentially, New York City itself. This success, however, came at a steep price. The total number of killed across all 3 phases of the battle reached approximately 670. General Johnson's command lost 18 officers. The Massachusetts Regiment suffered particularly heavily, with 70 men killed. The Mohawk contingent lost 60 warriors, a devastating blow that included their revered Chief Hendrick. French losses were also severe: 149 killed, 163 wounded, and 27 taken prisoner, including their commander. Baron de Dieskau, despite his multiple severe wounds, survived. He was eventually transported to London, where he remained a prisoner for the duration of the 7 Years' War. The battle also exacerbated existing tensions within the British command structure. General Johnson and the British commander-in-chief in North America, William Shirley, continued their acrimonious disputes. They disagreed sharply on the best course of action following the victory. Johnson favored consolidating the gains by constructing a substantial fortification at Lake George, while Shirley urged an immediate continuation of the expedition to capture Crown Point from the French, thereby opening a clear route to Montreal. Despite these internal disputes, the victory at Lake George significantly boosted morale throughout the British colonies. It also rekindled some of the strategic ambitions that had been outlined in General Braddock's ill-fated expedition earlier that year. The 7 Years' War, however, was still in its nascent stages. Much more blood would be spilled before the conflict reached its conclusion. The Battle of Lake George, a day of brutal combat and profound sacrifice, decisively checked French ambitions in the region. Its outcome bolstered colonial resolve, even as it highlighted the savage nature of the unfolding global conflict and foreshadowed the greater struggles that lay ahead for control of North America.